Roland turned to Agatha and asked whether this was the high order awakening she was mentioning. Agatha was at a loss for words for a moment. The only thought she had was, how did this happen? The holy city of Takara was forgotten, the Federation was annihilated. Without specialized training and guidance, witches' powers should have greatly regressed. But this young witch was able to undergo a high-order awakening. Moreover, the annoying prince mentioned that there were 3 others who had also achieved this. Agatha blankly stared at Roland, and it took her a while to regain her composure. For the first time, her arrogance disappeared. Agatha addressed Roland with a respectful manner, asking Roland about Anna's awakening experience. Roland patted Anna's head and explained that the first time was when her magic power was exhausted in a battle against demonic beasts. The second time occurred while learning new knowledge. Agatha wanted to ask what kind of knowledge, but Roland interrupted her, telling her they would talk about it later. What he wanted to know now was what the experiments written in Acris's diary about the God's punishment army. Putting her emotional turmoil aside, Agatha began to explain the contents of the diary. She said Acris was extremely powerful. Even with the God's punishment stone, she could stand her ground against several demon lords. She commenting that there were too few transcendent individuals. A better way to put it is that they lost in terms of versatility of witch abilities. Roland thought to himself. Understanding that not all ordinary people could awaken, not all who awakened could fight, and not all who could fight could become stronger. Agatha gently touched the diary and said, and this was the reason why they formed an army composed of ordinary people, but ordinary people were still too weak, unable to contend with the endlessly powerful demons. Under such adverse circumstances, Acris ordered them to start researching ways to empower ordinary people, allowing them to break the limits of the human body. Judging from what was written in the diary, it seems she succeeded. When Roland asked Agatha whether she, being part of the research group, knew the result, Agatha admitted that she had left the group after this order was issued and built her own experimental tower in the hidden forest. She hesitated for a moment before she revealed, the research group used the power of the God's punishment stone to forcibly combine witches' power and ordinary people, but this process required the sacrifice of the witches' lives. She couldn't accept such an experimental approach. Roland and Tilly were taken aback by the response. Seeing the sympathy and shock on Roland's face, Agatha felt less guarded towards Roland. With sorrow in her voice, the Federation is gone, and these experiments have disappeared as well. Roland interjected, telling her the God's punishment army still exists. This made Agatha's fingers stiffen as she incredulously stared at the prince. Roland, not knowing how to break it to her, slowly explained, an organization called the Church now established the Holy City. They initiated the witch hunt and continue to search for orphans to take back to the monasteries in the Holy City. The Church has its own armies and territories, the most powerful warriors among them being the God's punishment army. Beyond that, they also possess a group of powerful witches. Roland went on to explain why he had given Agatha the God's punishment stone, admitting he had been unsure about her origins at the time. Agatha was in shock. An organization composed of ordinary people had stolen the Federation's most important secret, and then turned around to capture witches and create the God's punishment army. Seeing her fatigue and discomfort, Wendy gently laid her down on the bed for rest, and removed the God's punishment stone from her foot. As everyone turned to leave, just as he was closing the door, Agatha heard a calm and steady phrase, "One thing you were wrong, ordinary people can defeat demons too." Back in his office, Nightingale reported that Agatha had fallen asleep and had eaten dinner, and now it was Sylvie's turn to watch over her. When Nightingale asked Roland if he believed Agatha's words, Roland expressed his intention for Nightingale to discern if Agatha was telling the truth the next day, but he believed most of what Agatha said was true. What surprised Roland was that Agatha, coming from over 400 years ago, used the same language and writing as they did, while the history of the major kingdoms was only around 300 years. If it was the Federation that led the survivors to escape to this land, then everything made sense. Nightingale looked at Roland with a smile, suggesting a wager. If Roland guessed wrong, he would owe her a luxurious lunch. Roland asked what if Nightingale was wrong. To which Nightingale tilted her head, saying Roland could ask for whatever he wanted.
Oh my
Roland forced his gaze away from Nightingale's perfect figure and back to the papers. He needed to sort out the information provided by Agatha. Suddenly, Nightingale mentioned, "Agatha doesn't seem to like Roland very much." Roland chuckled, not particularly concerned. He understood that Agatha once lived in a world where witches were superior to ordinary people, so in her eyes, Roland probably held no more significance than a weed by the roadside. When Nightingale asked if Roland didn't resent her for this, Roland shook his head. He had no reason to despise a pitiful person abandoned by time, who had slept in an ice coffin for over 400 years only to wake up to a completely different world. The unfamiliarity and fear would be present in anyone in such a situation. He knew that one day Agatha would gradually change her perspective. Nightingale smiled. This was the Roland she knew in her heart. When Agatha woke up again, the room was empty. She flexed her fingers and found that her strength had mostly returned. As she called on her magic, a sudden chill overflowed from her fingers. She walked to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain. The outside world was pitch black. When she opened the window, the cold wind instantly blended into the room. She was thinking about Roland's words today, wondering what kind of changes had occurred. Suddenly, a voice behind her asked if she was cold. Startled, Agatha turned around to see a woman sitting on the edge of the bed. Agatha looked at the door, it was closed, and she hadn't heard any footsteps. Nightingale introduced herself. Agatha frowned and asked if Nightingale was also a high-order witch. Nightingale thought for a moment, then understood Agatha was asking if she had evolved her abilities. Nightingale shrugged, said she wasn't as smart as Anna. The formulas and theorems in the books made her head spin. Agatha was stunned. Each word was understandable, but when strung together, they made no sense.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Remembering the prince's words, she asked Nightingale if she could see the book. Nightingale smiled and told Agatha that she could if she joined the Witch Union and served His Highness. Agatha's eyes widened, and she exclaimed, "How is it possible to serve a mere human?" Calling Nightingale gone mad. Nightingale was curious why Agatha came to this conclusion. Agatha replied proudly, she was once considered an oddity because in the holy city of Takira, most witches would only treat ordinary people as lowly servants, or even tools for reproduction. Although Agatha herself did not see it that way, she still thought ordinary people were stupid, but she believed through education, they can be changed. She taught them to learn and think, and handed over her work to the common people. However, the idea that the witches of the Federation would recognize a mere human as their master was too crazy to her. Nightingale shrugged and said that His Highness didn't regard them as servants. The truth was that he had taken in witches, allowing them to practice their magic and evolve into new powers, and allowed everyone to live in peace with the citizens. Together, they built the city and fought against their enemies. Agatha argued that this model has been proven to be a failure. During the first divine battle 900 years ago, humans and witches co-governed and were utterly defeated in the face of the demons' attack. This was the first time Nightingale had heard about this, and Agatha mocked them for their lack of knowledge about the demons. She warned that the third divine battle is in the corner and it's imminent and there is not a single safe land left in the world. Agatha believes that the Federation should be re-established, witches should be united, and then using what Roland described as the probability of high-order awakening through knowledge, to fight the demons. Nightingale didn't respond to Agatha's words, but continued to ask why she think that way. Just as Agatha was about to speak, Nightingale interrupted her. Nightingale didn't understand why Agatha couldn't let go of the notions from over 400 years ago. His Highness also mentioned that ordinary folks can defeat the demons, not just witches. His Highness wants to unite every ordinary person on the continent. Agatha was about to refute such nonsense, but Nightingale stepped closer to Agatha, asking her to lower her guards and let go of her arrogance, then confirm it with her own eyes. This time, Agatha's silence lasted for a while. She could tell that Nightingale didn't like her. Many witches from the Exploration Society often looked at her the same way, simply because she employed a group of ordinary people as assistants. She didn't understand why Nightingale, who didn't like her, would come and talk to her. Nightingale simply said that if Agatha could let go of her arrogance and treat His Highness normally, she wouldn't dislike her. She paused for a moment, adjusting her hair, and told Agatha that His Highness had said he didn't want to see Agatha being abandoned by the times again. In the holy city, Oberlin sat on the throne, gazing at Maine, who knelt on the ground. Oberlin's voice had become weaker. Maine stood up straight and sought his wrinkled face and his fatigue. Oberlin looked at Maine, knowing that his time was near. He had called for Maine today to pass on the position of Pope to him. Maine wanted to speak, but was interrupted. The guards serving the Pope helped him onto a trolley. Maine followed closely and entered the basement of the cathedral. Oberlin asked Maine to continue pushing him. Maine took the handle and pushed the Pope into the wooden door. The wooden door closed behind them again, leaving only the soft glow emitted by the yellow crystals in the room. Beside the crystals were hung different portraits, and soon they came to Oberlin's portrait. Maine recognized that all these portraits were previous popes. The archbishop listened to Oberlin's summary, while looking at the portraits, but a strange unease lingered in his heart. The people in the paintings were too realistic. As they passed halfway through the hall, Maine suddenly noticed that the characters in the paintings had turned into women. They had different faces and were dressed differently, but they were all too beautiful. Directly across the central aisle of the hall was a full-body portrait that occupied the entire wall. It hung behind the prayer table, surrounded by glowing crystals. When his gaze fell on the painting, he felt his heart jump. Maine found it hard to find words to describe the woman in the painting. Her red hair was like a burning flame, and the cold light in her hand was uncontrolled. She stood with her sword, her eyebrows slightly raised, and her eyes looked down. Maine struggled to turn his head, only to find that Oberlin had already knelt down. Oberlin bowed his head and said, "She was the first pope, the transcendent, Acarus." Maine's heart jumped. His previous guesses were indeed entirely correct. The early portraits of the popes were all witches. He couldn't understand why the founder of the church would be a witch. Oberlin didn't answer his question, but asked Maine to bow. After Maine completed the ceremony, he helped Oberlin back onto the trolley. Oberlin called Zero's name and asked her to take Maine to another room. Maine was somewhat confused, wondering how witches could be here. Zero went to the prayer table, and magical light flashed. Then she took a pendant from the Pope's neck and opened the door behind it. Maine followed Zero into the room. Looking at Zero's various rude behaviors, Maine thought that once he took control of the church, he would definitely make Zero understand the rules she must obey. Zero lifted a hidden panel on the wall, pressed her hand on the magic stone, and Maine sat down. Zero said this was the first time she activated this thing. Maine held his breath, and everywhere he could see was black. Suddenly, the ground lit up again. Maine incredulously watched as one by one lifelike female figures appeared in his field of vision. They were dressed in gorgeous robes, sitting around a long table, and sitting at the head of them was the first pope, Acarus. The witch next to her reported that the God's Punishment Army experiment had been successful. Some people knew that such experiments would cost the lives of witches and raise doubts, while some people did not care. Soon, both sides started to argue. Acarus said softly, "Enough." Although her voice was very low, the scene instantly quieted down. Acarus said that humans cannot defeat demons. They can do nothing and wait for the next demon invasion, or they can make a last bet and pin their hopes on the God's Punishment Army. She asked the witches present to make a choice, whether to give up resistance or to make an all-out effort. Maine stared intently at this illusion, and the shock in his heart was beyond words. He finally knew the true history. The conversion ceremony of the God's Punishment Army was actually invented by witches. In order to defeat the demons, they did not hesitate to use their own kind as sacrifices. No one gave up. The witches who raised doubts just smashed the table hard. The witch next to Acarus said that no matter how many witches are sacrificed in the conversion ceremony, new witches will always appear to replace them. The more humans, the more witches. When asked if the gods' punishment army can really defeat the demons, even Acris did not know the answer. But Acris's style of doing things is that even if there is a slight possibility, she will do her best. Everyone stood up and saluted Acris. The next step is to convince the other members of the Federation. An older witch said that many witches would not agree. If they want to implement the gods' punishment army's conversion without resistance, witches cannot exist as privileges above all, the Federation must be disbanded, and everything that has happened in the past must be completely buried. The image disappeared quickly, and Maine returned to reality. Zero came over, and Maine asked her to open the door. They walked out of the secret room. Maine staggered out of the illusion room. It took Maine a long time to calm his breath, finally knowing the origin of the church. In the end, Acris led her witches to defeat the witches from the other two cities and achieved victory, establishing new rules. Witches are no longer the chosen people above all, but the evil ones who are tempted and fallen by the demons. Acris died together with another transcendent witch not long after establishing the church, and the second pope inherited her will until all other factions were subdued. Ordinary people who did not want to participate in the witch war took root in different places and later formed civilization as the four major kingdoms known today. The witch war suffered severe casualties, thus they were unable to unify the continent. Oberlin said Acris died too early. Acris's close friend Natalia did not accept Acris's plan, and according to the history book, she attacked Acris during the meeting, but in the end, both of them died together. Oberlin said that if Acris were alive, the witch war could end 50 years earlier, and all the witches would be included to unify the continent at that time. After a moment of silence, Maine asked a question. He didn't understand why the previous popes were all witches, but later all became ordinary people. Oberlin asked Zero to leave the room first. Only then did Oberlin speak, saying it was because of cowardice and fear. Maine couldn't believe what he was hearing.